There, everybody. Hope you're doing all right. If you haven't had a chance to go read the notes on untangling the effect of sex, I suggest you go do that now. One of the techniques that the researchers use there is better described there than it is here, and it's also going to be used here. So, just for your own reference, go back and take a look at those notes. So, today, what we're going to talk about is the effect of race on judging, sort of what types of things happen when there's a diverse bench, what types of things happen when there are minority judges. Do the outcomes change? Do public perceptions of the judiciary change? And so on. So, the color barrier, just to give you a little bit of history, the color barrier was broken in 1937. William Hastie was the first black district court judge then, and he also happened to be the first black appeals court judge when he was elevated to the appeals court in 1950. Even in 2020, when this is being recorded, most judges in the federal judiciary are white. They're white men, to be a little more precise. Under 20% of federal appeals court judges are racial or ethnic minorities. Now, there's quite a bit more racial ethnic minorities at the district courts, but most of the people who are doing some of the sort of appeals work at the appeals court, and then obviously the Supreme Court, they're white. And there are various reasons that could change the outcomes of the justice system and of the judiciary. Okay, so if you take a look at sort of composition over time, going back to the mid 70s, it seems that most presidents still appoint white people. There does seem to be among the Democrats more of a push. So Carter, Clinton, and Obama, they're more of a push to diversify the bench, especially with black appointees. Though it would be unfair to say that Bush and the second Bush didn't also kind of push a little bit, especially with respect to Hispanics for George W. Bush. Now, these data are from, I believe, 2017. No, 2018, but they represent 2000 throughout 2017. So it's possible that Donald Trump has appointed some more racial and ethnic minorities since then. But anecdotally speaking, I don't think that's quite true. I still think it would kind of look like this, somewhere in the neighborhood of 95% white folks. So why do we care? You may be wondering, oh, come on, why do we care? There's a lot of reasons that diversifying the judiciary might matter. One of them is representation and legitimacy. Another one is shaping the law. That's sort of been the theme of the second half of this semester, right? What does the law look like? Who cares about votes necessarily, but what does the law look like, the final outcomes? And having a racial or ethnic minority presence on the bench might influence the way the law is shaped. And much like what we talked about with untangling the effect of sex, there might be panel effects at the appeals courts based on race. So let's talk about each of these in turn. So let's start with representation. Descriptive representation is a way for an institution to enhance legitimacy. And what I mean by descriptive representation, it's the idea that, and here I'm quoting, black legislators represent black constituents, women legislators represent women constituents, and so on, right? So it's having an official that looks like you, that describes you, right? And we see in other areas, specifically with respect to elected institutions, among black citizens, having a black representative leads to the following things: better communication. So black legislators are more likely to respond to their citizens, to black citizens, than white representatives are. Black citizens evaluate the representative's performance higher when it's a black representative, and they vote more. They turn out more when they have a black representative. So there are these positive effects, at least when it comes to elected institutions. When it comes to the judiciary, it's a little different, right? Because it's not an elected institution. So it seems people feel that they have less control over the institution. And you could see why that might make a great difference when it comes to descriptive representation. A couple of researchers, Shearer and Curry, they conducted an experiment to try to figure out what exactly representation, descriptive representation on the judiciary kind of does, what it looks like. So they randomized people who took their survey into three groups: a control group, a group who read a story about overrepresentation of blacks on the federal judiciary, and a group of people who read about the underrepresentation of blacks on the federal judiciary. People in the control group did not read anything about, they read some other story that had nothing to do with representation on the judiciary. The over group, the people who read the story about overrepresentation, were told that 23.2% of federal court judges are black, which is high compared to the black general population, which at the time was 12%. The undergroup was told it's only 3.9% of federal judges when it's in reality 12. All of the people in this survey were then asked questions that tap how legitimate they think the federal judiciary is. And legitimacy is basically what we're talking about is respect for the institution and the belief that we shouldn't make fundamental alterations to the institution. It should have the ability to do its job without meddling by other officials or the public. So let's look first at the results for black survey respondents specifically. Follow my cursor here. We see for the people that did not read an article about representation, rate the court a 4.35 on a 1 to 7 legitimacy scale. So they think it's legitimate, but sort of middle of the pack. For black respondents who read about underrepresentation, it is 4.58. Now that looks like it's an increase from 4.35. It's not a statistically significant increase. It doesn't. We can't say that those two values are different from one another, although it is surprising to see that the value doesn't go down. For people who read about overrepresentation, so for black respondents who believe that the federal judiciary is made up of 23.2% black judges, they jump up to about 5, which is higher than both 4.58 and 4.34. So what we see here is that black respondents who believe that they're well represented on the court believe the courts to be more legitimate. Now let's look at the responses or the results for white survey respondents. When they read no article, they rated it a 5.27 on a 1 to 7 scale. When they believe it to be underrepresented, that dips to a 4.96. So if they read that, blacks aren't well represented, people decrease their legitimacy. And here's the most surprising one. When they read the article about overrepresentation, so this is white respondents, when they believe that black people are overrepresented by about 11% relative to the general population, their support for the court dips. Their belief that the court is legitimate, that the judiciary is legitimate, that is, dips by a seemingly substantial amount relative to the control group or the no article group. So summarizing these results here, we see that people who think that they're being represented, black people who think they're being represented, they hold the court in higher regard than black people who aren't told anything about representation or believe they're being underrepresented. White respondents seem to like the court less when they think it represents blacks by a lot. When they're primed to believe that the court represents blacks, they decrease their support for it. So basically, the composition of the judiciary influences how Americans view it. Now, these numbers were fake. The researchers made those numbers up, or at least put them in contexts that were, a little different than in which one would normally experience them. But it tells us that the composition, the racial and ethnic composition of the judiciary influences the support that people have for the institution. Um, and in the long run, having that support influences the judiciary's ability to have its decisions enforced. Okay, so to put those two things together, descriptive representation can influence the court's ability to have its decisions enforced by the elected branches. That's a pretty significant finding. Okay, the second reason that I said we might care about representation on the judiciary is in shaping the law. Okay, we know that judges shape the law beyond just votes. This is something I've really been harping on a lot in this class. We've talked also about citations to precedent, right? So when a judge is writing their opinion and they mention other cases that came before it, and Supreme Court cases or other court cases, those are called citations, right? Just like you would cite something in a paper in this class. Having one's opinion cited a lot is a measure of his or her influence, right? So if I wrote a legal opinion and a lot of judges cite that opinion, it would suggest that I am more influential than a different judge who doesn't have her opinion cited a lot. If there are racial differences in who gets cited, so if white judges get cited more than black judges on average, that would suggest that because there are fewer minorities on the bench, they wouldn't have an equal ability to shape the law. A couple of researchers, Nelson and Hinkle, they wanted to see if this was true, if minority judges receive fewer citations and therefore influence the law less. So they looked at every opinion from the Court of Appeals, all courts of appeals, from 1990 to 2010, and they pulled out every single citation from every single opinion. And they identified the race, gender, and professional background of the citing judge and the judge they were citing. So if I'm the citing judge, I'm a white male and my professional background is, PhD from Michigan State, right? The judge being cited, if I was citing somebody, their background could be a black female who went to Harvard Law or something like that, right? So their question is if judges of the same race cite each other more, if judges of the same gender cite each other more, and if judges of the same professional background cite each other more, and if there's some combination of factors there. So here's what they find. The biggest effect tends to be for professional background. So consider Merrick Garland, who is a judge on the Court of Appeals. He went to Harvard. Each of his opinions is cited about 4 times on average. Now, some of his opinions are cited like hundreds of times, and some of his opinions are cited 0 times. But on average, his opinions are cited about 4 times. Now consider Diane Wood, who has been on the Court of Appeals the same amount of time as Garland, but she got her law degree from UT Austin, which is still a prestigious law school, but it ain't Harvard. She's cited only about 3 times per opinion. So it's less. There seems to be this this effect of professional background. The second piece of result here is that white judges are not less likely to cite non-whites, and white men are not less likely to cite women. So the interesting thing here about like influence on the law is that minorities actually disproportionately cite other minorities, and women disproportionately cite other women. So it's this sort of boosting effect among minority and women judges. It's not a sort of a suppression effect by non-minority or male judges. But nevertheless, this is evidence that diversifying the bench could influence legal outcomes. Having a larger pool from which to cite that's a little more diverse could lead to different legal outcomes. Another way to say this is it could broaden the range of voices that can influence legal development. Okay, now let's move on to panel effects. That was the third thing I said about why we might care about diversification on the bench. We know from the untangling sex lesson that the presence of women causes an appeals court panel to decide differently. In particular, a mixed sex panel is more likely to vote in a pro-plaintiff fashion on a sex discrimination case than an all-male panel. Okay. But the important thing there is that the presence of the female alters the behavior of the males. It's not just that, oh, the composition is different, so the outcome's different. No, the males behave differently in the presence of the female. The question here, is there a similar effect for minority judges? And the evidence we're going to look at only refers to black judges, but you might expect that the effect also pertains to other racial or ethnic minorities. A researcher, Jonathan Kasulek, tries to find the answer to this question. Is there a similar causal panel effect for race on the bench like there is for, excuse me, for sex? Now, he can't quite adopt wholesale the beliefs about women, right? So the mechanisms of influence might be a little bit different in the case of race. So the question is, why might a black judge influence a panel? Some of the possible mechanisms are A, in the deliberation process, B, just in the voting process, C, their mere presence, okay? So let's look at each of those in turn. For the deliberation one, after judges have a bunch of information on the case, they go deliberate the outcome. We've talked about this in the context of the Supreme Court, but the 3-judge panels at the Courts of Appeals do similar things. Here, a black judge may just discuss their unique life experiences. This is precisely what we expect when we're talking about female judges who bring their unique experiences to bear. This could quite simply just compel a this could compel a white judge to think differently. So the non-white judge could compel a white judge to think differently. Here's the problem with this. Deliberation takes place in secret. We'll never know if this is the sort of mechanism of influence, okay? The second option is just in the voting. A black judge could vote differently than a similar white judge might. So if the other 2 judges are split, they're the deciding vote. So if one judge wants to reverse the lower court and the other judge wants to affirm the lower court, the minority judge could be the deciding vote. But problematically here is that on the Courts of Appeals, there's actually not a lot of dissents. There's not a lot of split decisions. The consensual norms are stronger there than at the Supreme Court. So if a black judge decides to vote one way, the other judges might just go along with it instead of the black judge sort of being the deciding vote. So this would kind of be a peer pressure mechanism. This judge could kind of peer pressure, even if not purposely, peer pressure the white judges to agree. The final potential mechanism is just the presence. Basically, a black judge might just change the way a non-black judge evaluates a case. Just the context of them being there might alter the considerations. And there's a great quote here by Justice Scalia, who said of Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first black justice on the Supreme Court, he said, "Marshall could be a persuasive force just by sitting there. He wouldn't have to open his mouth to affect the nature of the justices' private conference and how seriously the justices would take matters of race. Just being there might change things." Okay. So let's get to looking for the evidence here. Kasulek tries to do 2 things. He tries to determine if black judges influence panels. They may not. And second, he tries to adjudicate between those mechanisms if they do influence panels. Just like with the female judges, it wouldn't make sense for them to bring being female to bear on all decisions. The same is true here. Being black probably shouldn't matter for a tax case. It probably shouldn't matter for an insurance fraud case or something like that, right? So there are certain cases where this is likely to matter. So he only looks at race-based affirmative action cases, right? That's an example where race is at the forefront of the issue, okay? He looks at all race-based affirmative action cases that were in the courts of appeals from 1971 to 2008. He looks at all sorts of information like the race of the judge, the party of the appointing president, the ideology of the judge, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's just look at the averages based on cases, okay? So the mean voting, all right, so here across, if you follow my cursor, across the x-axis, we have the percentage of liberal decisions. A liberal decision in an affirmative action case is that affirmative action is allowed, okay? Here on the y-axis, we have two different types of compositions, one by party and the other by race. Let's start with the party, okay? So when we have 3 democratically appointed judges, they are likely to vote for, they're likely to vote in a liberal decision on an affirmative action case somewhere around 75% of the time. Adding a single Republican appointee doesn't change that. Consensual norms are strong here. They're about equally as likely as the all Democratic appointee panel to vote liberally. Next, if we go to an all Republican panel, follow my cursor here, it's all the way at the bottom. So 3 Republican appointees, they're only going to vote in a liberal direction. Oh, I'd say that's somewhere around 40%, 35, 40% of the time. In other words, they're not likely to vote in that way. But if you follow my cursor again here, adding a single Democratic appointee kind of does increase it. They're around 50% now likely to vote in a liberal direction. Okay, so that's by party. Now let's move down here and go by race. So what we're looking at here, if you see my cursor, this is a panel made up of 3 non-black judges. About 50% of the time they're going to vote liberally. It's basically a coin toss. Now, if you go to the very bottom point and add at least one black judge, and remember, this is random assignment at the Court of Appeals. So one randomly assigned black judge shoots the percentage of liberal decisions up to like 90. Okay, so the presence of that individual, that black judge, makes a huge difference here. It goes from a coin toss to almost a slam dunk, guaranteed liberal decision. Now, if we look at these averages by individuals, we can see some other interesting things, right? So Democrat judges are going to vote about 75% of the time liberal. Republican judges, if you're following my cursor, about 50% of the time. Black judges, pretty much going liberal 100% of the time. And non-black judges, it's just above a coin toss. However, if you take that individual behavior and then add a black colleague onto the panel, okay, so this is if you look at my cursor here, this is a non-black judge, and they're going to vote about 50% of the time liberal. It's coin toss. If you follow my cursor here, this is a non-black judge with a black colleague on the panel. And all things considered, this could be a Republican, this could be a Democrat, right? They're more likely than not to vote in a liberal direction on the affirmative action case. Okay. So we see a lot of stuff there that just based on averages, it looks like there is a pretty big effect of having a black colleague. There's just a difference in voting when it comes to race, when there's a racial minority on the panel. To kind of summarize these results again, the all Democratic panels are most likely to vote liberal, the all Republican panels the least, but a non-black panel votes liberally about 50% of the time. A panel with only one black judge, that rises to 90% of the time. That's a huge difference. Non-black judges vote liberally about 50% of the time when they don't have a black judge on the panel. Non-black judges, when they do have a black judge on the panel, that jumps to about 80% of the time. That includes the conservatives. That's a huge jump. But here's the thing, these are just averages. These aren't causal evidence. Remember, go back to that, the notes on untangling sex where I'm talking about causality and this matching technique, right? These are just averages, it's not causal. So Kasteluk uses the same matching technique that the previous researchers used when it comes to sex. And this way we can get at, does having a black judge on the panel cause the vote? Does that cause a white judge to vote in a liberal fashion relative to having no black judges on that panel? Okay. Okay, ignore that. So let's look at the individual effects. This is not for the panel. Now, see here that there are two types of matching. Don't worry about that. It doesn't matter. That's him being fancy at statistics. So if we look at the full data, that is to say not matched data, black judges, the predicted probability of a liberal vote is very high, around 90%. Non-black judges, it's low, 50%, 55%. If we do the matching thing, these differences kind of close up a little bit. We see a little bit difference. So the average individual difference between blacks and non-blacks, it's around 25 to 30% in all of the data. But again, this isn't panel yet. So what we see here is that non-black judges they're just less likely to vote liberally on affirmative action than non-black judges. The difference is around 30%, and that difference holds when using the matching technique. So what we can glean from that is that this isn't just an ideology effect, right? The black judges tend to be more liberal than white judges do. The black judges don't tend to be more liberal than white liberal judges, but on average, the black judges are more liberal. So using these matching techniques, what we can see is that for the black judges, being black causes them to vote this way in affirmative action cases. I don't know that that's all that surprising. That's consistent with the theories that we've talked about when it comes to the effects of race and sex on judging, but at least that's pretty consistent. But let's look at the effect of adding a black judge to a panel. In other words, can having a black judge on a panel cause white judges to vote a particular way? Okay. So what we see here is something similar to what we saw earlier. The average predicted probability of a liberal vote when there's no black judges on the panel is around 50. When there is a black colleague, it's higher. These results hold when we do the matching thing. Okay, so that's the important thing. The average treatment effect of adding a black colleague moves the predicted probability of voting in a liberal fashion. Here we see 25 points, here we see 30 points and 30 points, right? So here again, this is the effect when there's no black colleague. This is the effect when there is a black colleague, all right? So to summarize this in words, non-black panels are not going to vote liberally on affirmative action. They're less likely to do that than panels with a black colleague. Basically, adding a black colleague increases the probability of a liberal vote by about 25%. And that holds with the matching techniques. This isn't an effect of ideology. The presence of a black colleague causes a non-black judge to vote in the liberal fashion, okay? If that black judge wasn't there, they wouldn't vote that way. But when there is a black colleague on the panel, they do vote that way. The presence changes things for them. Okay, now we're going to look at how non-black Republican appointees would behave under different circumstances. So this is a good test, right? Because Republican appointees probably less likely to believe in affirmative action just by the nature of the ideology that comes with that. So we're looking at white Republicans and what they would do in various circumstances, okay? So let's do it this way. Let's just say I'm a judge on the panel and I'm a white Republican. So I'll describe what I would do if these, if under different circumstances. Okay, so again, I'm a white Republican, and here we see, if you follow my cursor, when, excuse me, when the other two people on the panel, the other two judges are like me, they're white Republicans, we're voting for the liberal view like maybe 30% of the time. when when one of the other people on the panel is a white Republican and the other one is a white Democrat, we're still not going to vote in the liberal manner. It's something like 40% here. When I am the lone Republican here, but we're all white, it's like 70% liberal votes. But here, when one of my colleagues is a black Democrat and one of my colleagues is a non-black Democrat, we're voting like 80% for liberal votes. The percent of liberal votes in such circumstances are about 80% of the time. Finally, and this is really the crazy one, okay? Remember, I'm a white Republican in this circumstance. And then if you follow my cursor here, this final piece of evidence here, this final estimate is for when one of my colleagues is a non-black Republican and the other colleague is a black Democrat. So there's 2 white Republicans and 1 black Democrat. In those cases, the outcome is liberal like 85% of the time. So in that circumstance, the 2 Republicans, so me and the other Republican, the 2 white Republicans, have the opportunity to vote in a conservative fashion, but they don't. So they could win just based on numbers alone, but they don't because of the presence of their black colleague. So again, let me summarize these in words. Even Republican appointed judges are persuaded by their black colleagues. So this isn't just an ideology issue, okay? When a panel is made up of a non-black Republican and a black Democrat, the white Republican is going to vote liberally 85% of the time. So one black Democrat can persuade 2 non-white Republican appointees. That's a pretty substantial effect. Voting is not the mechanism of influence here. It seems to be that it's just presence. We can't know that it's not deliberation because, again, that happens in secret. So it could be deliberation. But what we do know is that it's not voting. It's presence. Presence just seems to matter. Having a black colleague sitting next to you, hearing a case about racial or about affirmative action, it changes the way you might intake that information. So to quote the author here, Jonathan Kastelek, he says, the random assignment of a black judge to a 3-judge panel in affirmative action cases nearly ensures that the panel will issue a liberal decision. So that's a pretty substantial effect of a single black judge. So what we learn here, or what I hope you've learned here, is that racial diversity on the bench matters, and it matters for a number of reasons. First of all, there's implications for public support for the judiciary. Second, it may shape the outcome of the law. Sort of the status quo of the law might be different, even if the direction of the law is the same. And finally, the mere presence of a black judge just changes the way non-black judges vote, at least in affirmative action cases. But it seems that just for sex, bringing unique experiences to bear, even if they're not outwardly expressed, changes things when it comes to judicial decision making. So black judges, even though they're not a lot of them on the bench, they can increase the range of perspectives considered by courts. And you know, if we're interested in sort of the law for all and the justice system working for everybody, that's probably a pretty good thing. Okay, so hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.